Hi, everyone. I'm Rena Ninan. Thank you for joining us. There is growing fallout after the top U.S. envoy to Ukraine testified yesterday. House Democrats have called it damning and disturbing. Bill Taylor appeared before 3 House committees. He was asked to appear in part because of text messages with EU Ambassador Gordon Sondland. In them, he raised alarm about President Trump's contacts with Ukraine. In a 15-page opening statement, Taylor appears to contradict the president's claims that there is no quid pro quo with Ukraine. Taylor writes, by mid-July, it was becoming clear to me that the meeting President Zelensky wanted was conditioned on the investigations of Burisma and alleged Ukrainian interference in the 2016 U.S. elections. It was also clear that this condition was driven by the irregular policy channel I'd come to understand was guided by Mr. Giuliani, referring to the president's personal attorney. But the White House claims that Taylor's testimony doesn't change anything. Press Secretary Stephanie Grisham released a statement accusing Democrats of, quote, a coordinated smear campaign. He also doubled down that there is no quid pro quo. I want to bring in Ben Tracy. Bob Cusack. Ben's a CBS News White House correspondent. Bob, editor-in-chief of The Hill. So, Bob, Democratic and Republican lawmakers are really giving drastically different reactions to Taylor's testimony. Here's Democratic Congressman Andy Levine following Republican Congressman John Ratcliffe.
All I have to say is that in my 10 short months in Congress, it's not even noon, right? And this is my most disturbing day in Congress so far. Very troubling.
This was about quid pro quo and whether or not the Ukrainians were aware that military aid was being withheld. And on that most important issue, neither this witness or any other witness has provided any evidence that there was a quid pro quo, or any evidence that the Ukrainians were aware that military aid was being withheld on July 25th.
So, Bob, this testimony was supposed to be a game changer. If there's still political disagreement over this quid pro quo, what does that mean for this inquiry?
Well, it's going to be partisan. I think that's clear. Now, maybe a couple Republicans in the House will ultimately vote for impeachment, but I wouldn't count on that. Here Republicans have a clear strategy, is that these hearings are behind closed doors. They're too secretive. Of course, the Taylor testimony, the opening testimony that you mentioned, is pretty damning. Now, Republicans can say, well, there's no proof of it. But remember, Taylor is a Vietnam vet. He's worked for Republican and Democratic administrations. He's a respected diplomat. And that's why this was so damning. And the White House had to go after this testimony. But it's hard to go after someone like Taylor, who's very respected.
And then on top of that, we heard Ratcliffe say that there's no evidence that the Ukrainians were aware of military aid was being held. But a New York Times report has this to say, that top Ukrainian officials were told in early August about the delay of $391 million in security assistance, undercutting a chief argument that President Trump, has really used to deny any quid pro quo. So does this further damage the president's defense?
It does. It hurts his defense. It certainly, Mick Mulvaney last week with his press conference that was really botched, that didn't help his defense, and that's why he had to walk that back. But this is not surprising. Interesting reporting. But the Ukrainians, this is hundreds of millions of dollars that this is a top priority for them. So they knew it wasn't some type of glitch. They knew there was a political reason. And there were people, certainly as Taylor testified, that Rudy Giuliani was involved as a private citizen to get some information about Joe Biden and the 2016 election, all that kind of stuff. So this really does hurt the White House defense. Now, the White House said, listen, we want to defend ourselves, and we're not being able to. And clearly, that's the White House and the Republican strategy of this week anyway. Ben,
I want to get you to weigh in. I want to read another passage. This comes from Taylor's testimony, where Taylor's recalling a conversation. This is back in September that he had with Tim Morrison, who was the replacement for Fiona Hill at the National Security Council. And this is what Taylor writes. This is according to Mr. Morrison, that President Trump told Ambassador Sondland that he was not asking for a quid pro quo, but President Trump did insist that President Zelensky go to a microphone and say that he's opening an investigation of Biden and 2016 election interference, and that President Zelensky should want to do this by himself. Ben, is Taylor's testimony undercutting the message from the White House, and how is the White House reacting?
It certainly is. The White House message has been there is no quid pro quo. That's a phrase that we've all become very familiar with. What you're hearing from Bill Taylor is there was a quid, there was a pro, there was a quo. So you definitely have that testimony undercutting the White House message. What's interesting, though, about the way the White House is responding is that they're not so much arguing on the merits here, going after the substance of the testimony. What they're basically going after is a process argument, saying that this whole thing is unfair, that the Democrats are doing this all in secret, and this is just a sham designed to smear the president. But what you're hearing from Bill Taylor is that this wasn't just about, looking into general corruption in Ukraine or even withholding a White House meeting because of corruption in Ukraine, which could be something that you could argue is appropriate. What he is saying, though, this is very much about the president wanting them to investigate his political rivals. And that is why this military aid, $391 million, which we should always remind people was approved by the Congress of the United States. It's not something really at the discretion of the president to decide about, was withheld from Ukraine.
And how do you compare? You're talking a little bit about Taylor's testimony. How does it compare to last week with Gordon Sondland's?
It's certainly different. I mean, you have Bill Taylor, essentially, as I just said, saying that there was this quid pro quo, that he very much understood that the military aid was being withheld because President Trump wanted these investigations into the Bidens. Now, perhaps the president didn't say that in those words that directly, and that is why the White House is trying to say there was no quid pro quo, but that's what Bill Taylor is testifying. Sondland came at it from a different perspective, saying this was more about general corruption in the Ukraine, and the president directly told him there was no quid pro quo. So, in effect, there was no quid pro quo. I think you could expect that they're going to want to bring Sondland back up to testify again now that they have this information from Bill Taylor.
Yeah. Bob, Laura Cooper is also supposed to testify today. She's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense overseeing Russia and Ukraine. CBS News has learned that some Republican lawmakers are staging a sit-in. This is to protest their exclusion from this closed-door deposition. When the president said yesterday he wants them to get tough, Republicans to get tougher, is this what they're talking about?
Well, Rena, this is part of it. Certainly, some Republicans are responding to what the president said, is that I need to have more Republicans back me. The Democrats, he say, stick together, and Republicans certainly, there have been some Republicans like Mitt Romney certainly have been critical of the president and his handling of all this. So this is part of it, and this is a problem because this interrupted the testimony, and now there's speculation that the Capitol Police may have to get involved because only members on those committees are allowed to come in. And to some degree, we've seen both parties do this over the years when there's something behind closed doors. It's a PR stunt, but it is meant to highlight the process issue here that Republicans both in the House and the Senate, including Mitch McConnell, have been complaining about.
I want to turn now to Syria. The president just a short time ago announced that he would lift sanctions on Turkey after they agreed to a pause in military operations. Here's what he had to say.
So the sanctions will be lifted unless something happens that we're not happy with. This was an outcome created by us, the United States, and nobody else. And now we're getting out. Long time. We were supposed to be there for 30 days. That was almost 10 years ago. So we're there for 30 days, and now we're leaving. It was supposed to be a very quick hit, and let's get out. And it was a quick hit, except they stayed for almost 10 years. Let someone else fight over this long, blood-stained sand.
I want to bring in CBS News national security correspondent David Martin into the conversation. David, we heard the president express confidence in the safe zone, that it'll be created, also that Turkey will be able to keep ISIS under control. Does the Pentagon share that same confidence?
Well, I think even the president in his remarks sort of suggested that the words permanent and ceasefire are a almost contradiction in terms in this part of the Middle East. So whether or not this safe zone remains safe remains to be seen. But in terms of Turkey keeping a lid on ISIS, this safe zone, even if Turkey occupies it all the way down to 20 miles across the border, which is what they say they're going to do, ISIS is operating further away from the border than that. ISIS is holed up in towns along the Euphrates River, which are many, many miles from the border. So the Turks will not have any military capability to keep a lid on ISIS there. The only responsibility they'll have for ISIS is some of the prisons where these captured ISIS fighters are being held will fall within this safe zone, and then Turkey is responsible for guarding those prisons. You have to assume that Turkey will guard those prisons because Turkey's got no truck with ISIS. They are as opposed to ISIS as anybody else, and I think would try hard not to let them escape.
And David, we know the president repeated this is going to be a small operation that will remain in Syria to secure the oil areas. How many troops are we talking about, and how long do you think they'll be there?
Well, the number on the table is 200, and they would be located around a place called Dar es-Zar, which is well away from all this safe zone up in the north. It's down on the Euphrates River, and that's where U.S. troops are currently partnered with local forces providing security for the oil fields. The reason they're providing the security for the oil fields is because smuggled oil had been a major source of cash for ISIS when it first rose up and started this crisis back in 2014. So you want to keep those oil fields from once again becoming a source of revenue for ISIS. But you can be sure that those 200 troops down there aren't just going to be sitting guarding checkpoints. They're going to be partnering with these local forces trying to go after ISIS sleeper cells. And how long will they be there? Well, in theory, as long as there are ISIS sleeper cells, as long as it is important to keep ISIS from getting revenues from smuggling oil. But, you know, Donald Trump has now ordered all U.S. troops out of Syria twice, once last December and then once this month. So as a practical matter, it remains to be seen how long they will stay there.
And, you know, looking at this also, Bob, you know, prior to the ceasefire, you know, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham had threatened last week to introduce separate sanctions on Turkey. Do you get the sense, will Republicans be satisfied by the president's decision at this point?
I don't think so. By and large, they're not satisfied, number one, how this handled or the policy. There are only a few Republicans that are firmly backing President Trump, and that's the Rand Paul wing of the party. And that's what Trump is trying to appeal to, is that ending the wars, pulling back troops also in Afghanistan. That is something that I think he's trying to set up for 2020. And he has a lot of people, of course, this country is war weary, but then you have a lot of Republicans who are saying our influence in the world by this move in Syria has been lessened. And of course, this does make Russia, Syria, and Iran a bit more powerful.
Ben Tracy, Bob Cusack, and David Martin, thank you for joining us.